to have an anxiety, which is one of the sort of dangers of today's times, is that it is opening the space for people who don't show signs of doubt. And why is this traumatic? You know, I was briefly mentioning how science is contributing to certain kind of an illusion about mastering of future, and in economy we also have certain kind of an illusion of mastering of risks. Now, all these illusions are quite often ways to deal with our anxiety. Since, you know, anxiety over death, decay is the most prominent anxiety in our life, we're endlessly searching for ways to tackle this anxiety. And science offers today one identification, one way of, you know, at least temporary, you know, appeasing anxiety, but often we open a new anxiety. As you know, one day you learn that coffee is good, the next day you learn coffee causes cancer, so you go from one identification with certain knowledge to another, you know, kind of in some way trying to keep anxiety in check, but opening new anxieties. But one of the ways people try to appease their anxiety is often when they are identifying with a person, a leader who appears not to have anxiety. Now, when I was researching years ago anxiety of people who are engaged in battles, I was privileged to meet a colonel, an American guy who was, you know, working, who was fighting in Iraq, and he had about, you know, 20 soldiers under his command. And I asked him, how do you deal with your soldiers when they are terribly anxious? And his answer was, for me, the horror is not when I see anxious soldiers. For me, the horror is when I see a soldier who does not have anxiety, whom I can see in his eyes a particular kind of an enjoyment, let's say, in killing. Now, the problem of today's time is that it does open a space in a variety of ways for people who don't appear to have anxiety. Corporations are opening spaces for leaders who don't show doubt, who have an enormous self-confidence. A kind of an ideal of a CEO does appear someone who is quite close to a psychopath, who doesn't have a feeling of guilt, remorse, and who is also capable of violence, like firing people. Some of you maybe saw the film Up in the Air, you know, where George Clooney's job is pretty much, you know, sort of firing people, or he's sort of outsourced to fire people for others. So in some way, violence, cruelty are part of an ideal of a corporate leader. You know, also in the sort of ideology of corporations, we have an idea of endless progress, you know, and endless search for profits. Now, in the States domain also, we are more and more opening spaces for authoritarian leaders. And to what Srečko was speaking about alternatives of capitalism, I would also mention India, with, you know, the new Prime Minister Modi, you know, a very nationalist, authoritarian leader who, you know, got an enormous support because he's coupling this authoritarian image with the idea of progress, especially sort of an economic progress, opening the doors to foreign investments and so on. Now, just in conclusion, in sort of, let's say, in psychoanalysis, we have to be always very careful when we meet people who don't have doubt. Now, especially when we're dealing with the idea of progress or scientific progress, the perceptions of where we might be going, you know, more and more, I think we should turn, you know, back to doubt, to sort of the fact that we don't have answers, that we actually have maybe more and more questions, but what we have to get rid of is the illusion of people who are in the positions of power, authorities who appear, you know, to have answers and who don't show signs of anxiety or doubt. Now, in the 50s in America, Steve Allen, a comedian, decided to create a new TV show which he called The Question Man. Steve Allen's idea was that we have too many TV shows where people need to give answers, and his idea was that why don't we pose people answers and ask them to give questions, and I think such a kind of reversal is more than needed today.
Okay, thank you very much for your impressive talk, Professor Saletzel. If I can briefly summarize it, that your ideas on neuroscience and biogenetics to me are related to the notion of current and future biopolitics, which rather than freeing humanity are practically controlling it stronger and stronger. And this leads me to the notion of culture industry, this Adornian concept, which is very much instrumental in shaping current subjectivities, And rather than, as I said, freeing people, it makes them more and more unfree and more controlled. This is something we are still unaware of, but therefore we need some deeper analytical, genealogical reading of liberal ways of subjectivization nowadays and in the future. So now, if I may turn to Professor Minchev, I couldn't possibly intervene in your thoughts and your plans discussion plans for today, but if you allow me, I just want to briefly mention the notion of democracy. Yesterday Professor Relic mentioned it once, and Srečko was the second one mentioning today in relation to this idea that the marriage between capitalism and democracy is over. So we only mentioned the idea and the practice of democracy 2 times, although we are very much critical, to capitalism and to liberalism. How would you reflect on it, on the idea of viable, can we possibly have democracy nowadays? Did we ever had true democracy? Of course, this is in relation to your idea for discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll also try to make several points before we go to the discussion. My first point is it might be interesting to leave the last 5 years, which are kind of a favorite period for debating the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of capitalism, and so on, and try to go in the beginning of this period, which was dominated by neoliberalism as part of the new conservative wave of the late 70s. If we take a look there, we will mention the first significant, according to me, difference in interpreting what's called free market. The difference between free market as ideology and free market as a system of reproduction. In the late 70s, at 76, Daniel Bell published his book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where he said that the welfare system of the decades after the Second World War has actually jeopardized to a large extent the ethics of capitalism. So it's an ethical issue to return to free market, where the values described by Max Weber in his famous book will be revived. So that was the ideological legitimation of the neo-conservative, economically neoliberal revolution in the late 70s and early 80s. But if we leave for a moment ideology and take a look at the problem from the perspective of free market or market as a reproductive mechanism, we see completely different logic of this turning from Keynesian welfare state into more or less free market capitalism. It was the case that the demand economy, national-based demand economy, was producing a cycle which was actually impeding the globalization as a process. Because in this demand economy, the government was taxing the rich, investing funds in the poor sections of society. They were spending the money on the market and therefore stimulating the supply afterwards. But with the globalization, with making economy global, national governments invested in the demand of the poorer sections of society, but poorer French, taking French governmental subsidies, went to the market not buying only and predominantly French cheese, French cars, French TV sets, French boots, but buying Japanese cars, Taiwanese TV sets, and so on and so forth. So this stimulation had no meaning. And in order to support globalization, the system had to actually contract the welfare state. And this was the meaning of the neoliberal revolution, to give green light to globalization and to hamper the opportunity, the capacity of the nation state, of the national welfare state, to do this cycle of stimulating demand. As we take a look at that, we see how different is the ideological legitimation of one concept, of one reality, from the real status of this reality, the free market reality, in terms of functioning, in terms of reproductive mechanisms. This is my first point. My second point, while I was listening to Professor Tasic, I just thought about the opportunity to make the difference between economic analysis and larger scope of analysis. In the economic analysis, you have logic which is without any mistake. You can defend free market with the instrument of economic analysis, and this defense is unbeatable. But I remember a famous book by George Tsibellis of the 90s called Nested Games, in which it was said that the logic inside the nest is very, very different from the logic in the context. So if you take the economic analysis as the nest, you have to actually consider the opportunity for having much wider logic outside of the nest, in the context of the nest. And this wider logic might be the logic of different societal agents, different values, and different purposes. So if the free market is ultimate within the economic analysis, then what we have when we go to the larger societal aspect of the issue, we have a nation state which needs improvement, which needs to make its community, its national community, more integral. So it has to redistribute in order to perform that. You have a nation or a community, leave the nations, a community which has to modernize. In order to modernize, you have to bring a large amount of people to the market. You have to develop market access in mentality first and in action second, of those people, lead them and bring them to the market and create a modern community, modern nation, modern whatever. So this requires a strategy which does not stem directly and excessively by the free market instrumentarium. You need different type of logic. Next point. Michael Novak, a theologian and political scientist in the early 80s. I'm older than most of you, so this is why I remember things that you don't. Michael Novak in the early 80s published a book called The Values of Democratic Capitalism, I think. So in this book, he was most ardently supporting the point that free market and democracy are presupposing each other. You can't have decent democracy without free market, and you can't really have a free market without democracy. Nowadays, we have an accumulation of cases which show us that this is not exactly how history developed. We have China. How free market is China is another question, but nevertheless, the market success of China is something which is unquestionable, without having too much democracy, mildly speaking, in China. On the other hand, you have established examples like, for example, Austria in Europe, which is quite far from free market. It's quite excessively regulated in all fields of public life and economic life, but it is democracy, beyond doubt. I think that when we consider free market and democracy, we have first of all to remember what is free market, what we think of a free market, and what, for example, Adam Smith thought of a free market. If you take a look at the present-day libertarian or free market advocates, you might consider that free market equals to the invisible hand. While Adam Smith did not say such a thing. Adam Smith said that free market is invisible hand at local level, at his time at local level. Secondly, the free market is this famous night guardian that has to make laws of functioning, otherwise it becomes a jungle. And last but not least, free market requires the existence of a code of public ethics, which in a local market is normal to have within a community which is involved in the market. Code of public ethics. This is why capitalism of the 19th century, which grew up to national markets, developed the class wars so favorite for Marx and others, because this larger community, national community, did not have the opportunity of common code of public ethics anymore. It developed to an extent later on, but it took decades, if not centuries, to do that. So from this perspective, I think that if we consider the free market as a background for democracy, we have to say that free market or free market capitalism is only one mode of reproduction in society. Probably capitalism is irreplaceable. I agree with that at this point. At the point in which we are having a society of individuals at modern level of development, of integrated, structured, ego-personal systems, at the level in which we are actually having the mentality and the motivation of personal benefit predominantly. In such a society, capitalism is unavoidable. The problem is whether we are sticking to a mode of reproduction which is solely capitalist, which is only capitalist, which relies only upon free market. I think that the system which was banned as inefficient in late 70s, early 80s, that was the system of Keynesian type of capitalism, was more supportive to democracy rather than the neoliberal model which came instead afterwards. Why? Because in this system we were having at least three modes of reproduction which were freely competing among themselves. The free market, or the market system, first, governmental regulation, second, and civil society, organized interest, which constituted the present-day pluralism in society, third. Those three modes of societal reproduction were openly competing, and the competition among them was creating what we can call an open society. Nothing to do with the famous foundation, but to do with the sociological concept of open society as a society which moves in a direction which has not actually a definite end given in advance. This was the free competition among those modes of reproduction was providing the opportunity for such open society existence, and that was really the heyday of democratic competition, because the scope of the market, the scope of regulation, and the balance between government and civil society was an open issue. And you had social democrats claiming more government, you had liberals claiming more market, and so on and so forth, and people were able to choose. What happened in the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century? Why? Probably there are different reasons why democracy might be in decline in Europe or in the West or elsewhere. But one of the reasons definitely is that the economic field, the economic ratio was excluded from political competition. We were all neoliberals in the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century. We were all neoliberals. So the difference might come from other sources. The left would love global liberal economy because it kills the nation state, which is the basic enemy, and produces new internationalist order. The right might love neoliberalism because it very much applies to their understanding of individualism and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into that. But nevertheless, the basic, most important issues for an individual, for a citizen, for a group of citizens, which is more or less related to the economy, were excluded from the public debate, which contributed a lion's share to the perception of the people that there is an elite conspiracy against the community. The elites are integral. They speak one and the same thing. They are actually pretending that they are competing politically. They are integral and they work against us. I'll end up with a few words on the implications of all those issues and processes upon post-communist Eastern Europe. I think that the neoliberal ideology was very dangerous, and it actually contributed to an extent for many of the problems we are facing. Not all countries, not Poland, not Czech Republic, probably not Slovenia, but definitely the countries of Southeastern Europe, definitely the post-communist, post-Soviet space in Eastern Europe. We had to perform reforms, two types of reforms simultaneously, political reform and economic reform. The political reform was what? Establishing democratic institutions. Economic reform was what? Letting the invisible hand go. We let the invisible hand go, but instead of the invisible hand, several months or years later, we have received the visible fist of the mafia. What happened? What actually happened is that transforming the institutions, we have reduced their efficiency. Any entity under reform is reducing its efficiency, its functional capacity. At the same time, the only organized group of society around the former regime groups took advantage of that. And they actually appropriated in a very well-known manner among us the national wealth of all those countries I mentioned, in the east and in the south. They came out of the underground and they established the oligarchic link of control upon the weak representative institutions. Central Europe was to an extent saved from that destiny because of the still existent and acting Habsburg public administrative tradition. Administration in those countries was performing well when the political system, the representative system, was in formation and in transformation. In most of the other countries, we didn't have efficient administrations, and that actually has led to those ex-regime groups coming out of the underground with their new properties to establish the oligarchic link upon the state. And they needed legitimacy. They badly needed legitimacy because it was open theft. It was open theft. And they needed legitimacy. Who and how legitimated them? I'm sorry to say that because I've been on the side of advocating fast market reform. Neoliberal ideology provided legitimacy for them. Neoliberal ideology said, look, the government is a bad dealer. The government is a bad owner. Leave the government. Leave the bad government. Everything on the market. And they said, yes, of course. Everything on the market. What's the market? That's it. That's another thing. We come back to the division line between market as ideology and market as reality. There's no market in an oligarchic system of this type that we have developed in the last decades. But we have strong market ideology which legitimizes this oligarchic system. And this is the problem, and this is the problem that we really have today. And this is what I'm going to end up with, saying that, Yesterday I made a note about the opportunity of all our countries to efficiently join the European Union. I'm definitely advocating, and all my life in the last 20 years I have advocated that opportunity for all of us to join the European Union as fast as possible. The problem is that we have self-ghettoized ourselves into that kind of a oligarchic system which is a dead end, which is a spiral directed towards its center. And my experience as Bulgarian, a person who lives in a country of the European Union for 7 years now, is that it doesn't make quite a big difference being self-ghettoized in the European Union or out of the European Union. You first of all have to break through. The European Union cannot serve you in resolving your domestic issues, the issues of sharing power and sharing wealth in your own society. The European Union cannot fix the fact that your power holders are actually mocking democratic politicians because they don't understand them. They can't steal as much as they do. And so on and so forth and so on and so forth. Free market is something, and capitalist system is something that I personally think is here to stay and should stay, because the first 3 decades of my life passed in a system without a market, where market was illegitimate. And I hate to think that we can go back to that kind of a system. At the same time, we don't have to forget that market and capitalism is only one element of our more and more complicated societies. So we have to take care not only about the market, which is here to stay, but we have to take care about the strategies at all levels, not only governmental and above governmental level, but at the level of civic organizations, strategies which can use the market and modify the market for our public and private good.
Thank you, Professor Minchev, for this very exhaustive overview. I really like your historical perception of how neoliberalism developed and later on married with the narrative of globalization. It became a totalizing ideology. I also like the way you pointed out how globalism links with the notion of democracy, which was especially visible in the southeastern societies, which in my view also, I will agree with you, devastating effects. So now I would like to open the floor for questions and ask the public to raise some issues in this relation. So first it was Dejan Jovic, then it comes in, and then it's Bun.
Thank you. Yeah, is it working?
No,
it's not. Sorry?
We hear you.
Oh, okay, fine.
It works now.
Right, okay. I like Srečko Horvat in general, and we have no problem personally at all, actually. And it's on the contrary, I mean, I really admire what he does. But I must say, I actually very much disagree with what he has just said here, the way he presented the reasons for collapsing of Yugoslavia. I mean, let me just remind you that the IMF actually advocated very strongly preservation of Yugoslavia. And it supported Ante Markovic, who was the main actor, who actually advocated this within the country. And that unlike that, for example, those people who were the most responsible for the failure of the Yugoslav concept were 3 Marxists, or should I say, leaders of the Communist Party or members of the Communist Party. In Slovenia, Milan Kučan, in Serbia, Slobodan Milošević, and in Croatia, Franjo Tudjman, who came out of retirement having been an important member of the Communist Party prior to liberal reforms in Croatia. So he came back from the 50s and the 60s, very largely defining himself back in 1989 as being a Croatian man, revolutionary Marxist, and a historian. That's what he says of himself. and thinking of the right to secession pretty much along the same lines as in the communist tradition, all the way from the beginning onwards, from Lenin and Stalin onwards. So the point I have here is that to blame or to kind of associate responsibility for the collapsing of Yugoslavia with something like IMF is mistaken. And you know, these protests in Yugoslavia of the 1980s, in fact, well, yes, that's true that there were so many people involved, but what were they advocating, in fact? What were they wanting? What did they want? Did they want more freedom and more capitalism? No, really. They wanted more state and more, you know, firm hand and even Stalinism. And that's how they somehow ended up. Really, they ended up with introduction of